Well, hello everybody. I didn't bring this up on YouTube yet, so I can't see any comments like a scrub. So I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to talk. So I'm going to be slightly distracted as I do both, but it's
Don't
going to
be
be
a
so
scrub.
worth it. Welcome to StorySights, everybody. Thank you for rejoining us. I know we had a week off last week. Really appreciate all of you understanding as we took a little brain break here in Wattpad land. I imagine for if you're like us, odds are you probably were writing or thinking about writing or doing writing. So break is a real is a real relative term in writerland. But we're happy you're back, and we're as always very excited to get to chat to you today. One piece of just kind of like general housekeeping before we get started. We're going to be moving StorySights to Thursdays, same bat time, same bat channel. Well, different bat time, but same bat channel. Just because Wattpad is doing some shuffling to help us all prevent burnout. So we're not booking meetings on Fridays anymore, which is amazing. And we want to make sure that we're not coming in all sleepy and non-meeting-y when we're here. So we're moving them to Thursdays. So keep an eye out for that. We'll obviously post about that in all the usual places that we post. But otherwise, I guess it's time to get down.
Oh,
to
let me get the sprint starting. Yeah, there we go. I shall set the timer.
Yeah, it is sprint o'clock. It is 4:02.
15 minutes to write.
Get those fingies ready and hop to it. I wish you all the best and the best of luck on this incredibly sunny Friday, at least up where we are. We had a few, obviously we're still working through the questions that had been submitted in advance, and there were a couple that kind of synced up kind of nicely here today around atmosphere and character, and how best to describe things, how best to introduce things. The question was specifically around third person, but obviously in first person, this happens as well. So we'll be dealing with both of those today, but as always, if you have any questions or comments or strong feelings or amazing recipes, you can just drop them in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that throughout. But these are important things because ultimately, when you're writing a book, and this is something we've talked about a bit before, but I just want to touch on briefly again. It's a little bit like the difference between a photograph and a painting. In a photograph, you're capturing all of the things that are present when you snap the shutter, or I guess push the digital button and the robot keeps it in pixels or whatever the hell. I'm old. But it means you get everything. You have no choice once you're looking through that frame of what is there or not. And if you've ever seen any of the hilarious Photoshop jobs that people have requested that end usually in hilarity and nightmares, there could be anything from someone walking through to some trash blowing by to any number of weird things. Whereas when you're painting, you start with a blank canvas. And whatever you are putting on that canvas, even if it's a mistake of a brush stroke or anything else, you have physically added yourself. There is intentionality behind each and every brush stroke that you put to that canvas. And writing is the same way. We're starting with an absolutely blank page. In film, even to some extent in theater, other written mediums, there are comics are a great example. As the writer, you're coming up with the script, but there are a bunch of other factors at play. How the actors perform it, what the lighting is, what the sound is. In comics, what your collaborator, the illustrator, has chosen to do with the panel, with the ideas that are there. As a writer, you have none of that. You have none of those constraints. It's purely you. So how you choose to describe things, introduce things, and create things for us is completely up to you. And that's kind of why we want to take some time to talk about that today, because it's something you'll encounter every single time you sit down to write. And it's something that is absolutely vital to creating a lively and exciting and engaging story for your readers. And as you know, on Wattpad in particular, it's got to be engaging because there's so much that they could go read, and you want to keep them reading yours. So, Nick, do you have anything to add to that before we jump into Atmosphere, our first?
I'll say no, but I mean, like, similar to what you're saying with the picture and the canvas, you just have to remember as we get into Atmosphere, like, everything that you put on the page is your choice. It's not, unlike a camera, it's not something I didn't mean to take a photo of that. Shoot, that was accidentally in the background. Can't get away with that in writing. You put it in there. Everything you wrote is what you created. So you have to remember as the reader engages with your content, they know that as well. So they're thinking like, okay, you put this in here for me to read, so it must mean something.
Hmm.
So that's a really powerful thing to take advantage of. It's a curse and a blessing basically. It's a curse when you are writing and you're like, this isn't actually important, but I have to make sure to include it. Not great. It's a blessing though when you know like, okay, I can really set the atmosphere because they're hanging on my every word, right? Everything that I say is extremely important. Although, as you alluded to, particularly on Wattpad, there's so much competition, and it's all free for the most part. What's stopping someone from just stopping reading just not reading your story, bumping over to the next story? I'm sure they can find another one that's similar-ish. They probably already have like 100 in their library, so they'll just go through and be like, okay, not this one, I'm off to this one. Whereas normally, like if I don't like a book, I gotta go to the bookstore and find another book. It's a whole ordeal. So once you have a book, like you just committed at that point. On Wattpad, not so much. So in terms of statistically, you have about less than 30 seconds to capture someone. About a minute, but it is like safe. But less than 30 seconds to capture someone before they turn away. Weirdly, when we read content, we actually evaluate content for longer than the average reader does because we're very forgiving. We're like, hey, I'll read this, I'll check it out, I'll give them some time to ramp up to it. The average reader does not do that. They open it, they don't like it, they just close it and move right back on again. It's very fast. So that's why these intros are incredibly important. Intro of atmosphere. Take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. And that isn't something I just want to touch on before we get too deep into this. Is this isn't something to be afraid of. It's something to, I would say, embrace and learn to love. As an actor, when I used to be an actor, and I remember I had people tell me that in an audition, generally speaking, you can tell whether you're going to see the person for a callback or give them the role within about 5 seconds. First line. And I hated that. I was like, no, no, no. I have this amazing 2 minute monologue. And like it builds to such an amazing emotional point. Like, how dare you suggest that it's that simple? And then I was on the other side of the table and I was like, oh God, it's that simple. And it's astonishing. It's astounding how fast um, you get to that point. And I would argue, to Nick's point, books are similar. It's not just the first line, it's usually the first, I don't know, couple paragraphs. But if I'm not hooked by then, I'm out. So let's talk about how to get those hooks in and really get people excited. So right out of the gate, let's talk about adverbs. This was an additional question that I kind of grouped in with these. But when thinking about describing things, a lot of the time you'll hear this is a very, very common piece of writing advice. Don't use lys. So quietly, nervously, like all these kind of qualifiers. And the reason for that is that it often leads writers to accidentally tell instead of showing. So you'll always, always, always hear show don't tell, right? Like this is a thing that has been just floated constantly. And to our point from the beginning of this, you're writing everything. So technically everything you're doing is showing or is both showing and telling. So I get confused about that. I have been confused about that. And it's a piece of advice that is incredibly useful, but also incredibly confusing.
It's
So,
almost intentionally. So I'm convinced like there are people who drop that advice and then just walk away. And I'm like, that's less useful than the advice is.
well, it's the classic arcane knowledge thing, right? It makes you seem real clever. It's also very charming. Like there's a musicality to it, and there are all these sorts of reasons that our brains fixate on these sorts of things. So, what are we actually talking about when we say show don't tell? Showing is usually more valuable because it lets our brain breathe a little bit and fill in the gaps. As you know, when you're a reader reading a story, you are actively creating the entire world in your head. Everyone has a different way, and really don't think too much about this because it'll completely mess with your head. But everyone has a different way of interpreting the written word in their minds. Some people see it very visually, others don't. There's a whole bunch of different ways because our brains are just a weird, crazy question mark cloud that no one understands. But what we do know is that every time you're reading, you are creating a version of this world in your head. Now, as a writer, you had a version of this world in your head that you created and attempted to bring to life for other people. That's the whole exercise of writing, putting the words to the page so that people can generate in their heads their own version of the world that you've seen. And ideally, if you're doing your job, quote, quote, correctly, they're seeing what you also saw. Now, the truth of it is we all interpret the world in different ways. We all have different experiences and different influences, different understandings of the way the world works. And as a result, we will see things differently than the way you imagine them. And that's totally fine. That's great. And that's actually one of the most exciting things about the partnership of the writer and the reader, is that I've done my best to lay out a world for you, and then you get to take it away and imagine it however you like. It leads to some of the most heated debates in fandoms about, particularly if you, even if, like, the simplest version is just if you make a movie of a book and everyone's like, that's not how that character would be. You're like, well, that's how they are for this. So all that to say that one of the dangers with adverbs is it is you cheating as a writer, because it's an easy way to express an idea. For instance, I know my character is nervous. He's going to tell the boy that he's in love with that he would like to go on a date with him, single date. But we know, because we've been following his journey, that he is like head over heels in love with this guy. Really nervous to tell him.
It's the highest point of nerves that someone can achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, this is the apex moment of nervousness. And so as a writer, in my head, I can see and feel emotionally all of the things that my character is, because I'm thinking through, okay, how would this guy that I've imagined, how is he feeling? Is he confident? Is he scared? Is he, like, all of these sorts of pieces, right? Now, in my rush to get to the exciting bit, which is saying, hey, would you like to go see a movie sometime in a world where you can still go see movies?
Sure.
I want to get to that point, because as a writer, I know that's where it's going, and that's where the meat is. That's the exciting, like, that's the climax of this little sequence. But if so, in that rush, I might just say, Theo shuffled his feet nervously. And it's like, okay, that's fine. That's an idea. It's not wrong by any stretch. But consider shuffled his feet. That's evocative. I can imagine what that looks like. And that tells us a lot about his state of mind. He's not calm. He's not balanced. He's shuffling around. I'm already getting more from that than nervously. Nervously is just a vague term that could kind of describe anything and isn't nearly as satisfying as a reader to encounter. It's a shortcut. It's just us saying, like, okay, and he's kind of this. Don't worry about it. Now he's going to say, let's go on a date. Whereas if we said, fiddling with his watch and shuffling his feet, Theo said, hey, would you like to go to a movie sometime? We get all the nervous piece. It's all there, but we've had a chance to actually, as readers, to build our image of what that is and to really enjoy it. And that, to me, is the main difference. That's ultimately all Show Don't Tell is talking about, which is giving us enough breadcrumbs as a reader to get to construct the experience in our minds, rather than just giving us a vague term. Because the thing is, we will understand that vague term, but nervously doesn't give us a clear picture. It could give us any number of pictures, or it could give us nothing. I know for me, if I read that word, I'm not imagining him nervous. I'm just jetting ahead. And you've lost that chance to create that little beat.
Well, you don't have to imagine it anymore. You just don't have to. You can be like,
yes.
Oh, if you say, look, he's shuffling his feet and he's fidgeting with his watch, you have to imagine him doing those things. And then you will layer onto that. In order to try and understand it, the brain has to then say, like, okay, how do I know what's going on here? It has to go through its memories of, like, okay, have I ever seen someone do that? Or it has to compare to itself. Have I ever done that? Okay, whenever I've shuffled my feet and fiddled my watch, I've been nervous. So I think this character is nervous. Whereas when you say nervously, it's just like, oh, the work is done for me here. I don't have to process what's going on, so I'm not even going to try to imagine it, because your brain likes to cut every possible corner it can. So it'll just be like, oh, we're moving on then. If you told me they're nervous, like, we're done here.
And it can mean different things to different people, right? So let's say I want this to actually be an incredibly sexy scene. I want this to be like the beginning of a seduction. And I say nervously, but I mean kind of in that, like, biting your lip, fleeting glances, that sort of thing. If I just say nervously, you could interpret that as, like, sweating buckets, shifting from left to right, really awkward. Like, it's very vague. So all that to say, we're looking for clarity in all things. If you get nothing from any of these story sites, clarity is the absolute best thing you could do. And finish your story, but also clarity.
And write lots. Write so many sprints.
Write lots. Yeah,
write all the time.
Every minute of the
That's
day.
Fair. I think, but like this stuff and getting into the atmosphere, because this is really important for setting it. Like, the way that I flipped it, and there's a lot of great stuff on the side here from people talking about the ways that have connected. The way that I've flipped it personally that's helped me was, one is I flipped it to tell to show instead of show don't tell, which was that, because as you said, like, you have to tell. It's writing. You're telling people something. And so when I reframed it as, like, but what you tell them is what matters, right? Do you tell them they are nervous, or do you tell them they are shuffling their feet and fiddling with their watch, right? Both of them are telling. That way you don't have to feel like what's showing versus telling. It's like they're both telling, but one of them just tells you something. It doesn't tell you anything else, just it tells you they are nervous. The other one tells you things which in turn show you some other thing. I've told you these two factors about them, and they show you some third thing. The greatest example for this, though, that really solidified it for me is kind of like the bad boss or the bad girlfriend or boyfriend, which is if you have a friend and they're telling you about just like their boss or their boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it is, partner, and they're just like, oh my God, they're the worst. I hate them so much. They're so bad. I hate them so much. Like they're always just the most annoying. You'll be hearing it, but as their friend, you're probably kind of like, maybe, but I kind of know you. You're a little lazy, or I don't know if I fully believe you. Like, I haven't heard their side of it. Maybe they're not that bad, right? You kind of process them telling you, like, oh no, but my boss is the worst, just so bad, or my boyfriend is so unreliable. But if instead they just told you about, like, a story that happened at work today, they're like, oh, my boss pulled this one person aside because she dropped something and just, like, yelled at them for 10 minutes. You're kind of like, your boss is terrible. Your boss is so bad. I hate your boss. You're even more angry sometimes than they are. Sometimes they'll be like, oh, yeah, I guess my boss is really bad. I didn't realize that. That's showing versus telling. And you convince people of things much better and easier. And that's what really matters with the atmosphere stuff. Like, you need people to buy in to what's going on. If you just tell them, like, okay, they're nervous and the world is really creepy and really cool looking, but, like, creepy. People are like, sure it is. Whatever you say. But if you kind of sell them with other facts, they're kind of just like, I think this world is creepy and I think these characters are, I'm more into it now than I was before. And so before we get into this, that is the end of a sprint going on by 15 minutes.
You did it if you're writing, and even if you aren't, I'm still proud of you. If you are doing some writing, feel free to throw your word count in our chat as always. And if you're not,
The 5 minutes begin.
It's totally fair. But yeah, we're gonna take a 5-minute break. So like grab some water. I'm out of water, so like drink water on my behalf. I'm just gonna continue to sit here and like
I got me
get
some water
more dehydrated
before
this. by this nice like pot of coffee I've been working through. Right. So with all this in mind, we're gonna address a couple of comments in the chat first, and then we're going to slip into atmosphere and how this relates to directly creating it. And Nick, you've given us a great intro to this because it's a creepy place is a perfect example of not giving enough information. Now, that said, as Avery pointed out in the chat, showing can also go too far. This is a big issue as well. And this is one of the reasons that craft is so important in writing. And one of the reasons that, again, I'm so happy that all of you have joined us for this. Because it means you're thinking about your craft, and you're thinking about your craft over and above, I'm someone who is engaged and has a story I want to tell, which is amazing. You need that. That must be present. Otherwise, you can't do the work. But there's a danger in not giving us enough and being too vague. There's also a danger in giving us too much, being overly descriptive, spending too much time describing things that as a reader, we actually don't need. In some cases, that just kills the pace, which admittedly on Wattpad is kind of the kiss of death. But it can also rob the reader of a better experience. The thing I always lean on is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where she never describes the monster in detail. She just describes enough. And she did that by fully intentionally as kind of like the first real dedicated science fiction horror writer to be like, you will imagine a worse monster than I could ever give you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you just enough. And if you think back to, if you have read it, there's just like a beautiful description of like stitched flesh. Like just even like think of that stitched flesh. I'm sure that evoked a huge image for me. I'm sure it's evoked an image for you. If I'm then like, yes, well, you know, he's about 6'3", broad shoulder on one side, other side, not so much. You know, he's wearing a tracksuit. Like it immediately loses all its weight and interest, as opposed to, you know, humans are by nature scared of the dark. And by keeping your reader a little bit in the dark, you can create much more horrible things than if you were to fully outline them. Think about every horror movie that has been ruined by showing the monster, because it's most of them, particularly in the age of
it's all
of
the ones that
CGI.
show the monster.
It's like in the age of practicals, maybe a bit different, but like in the age of CGI, just every time you'd be like, oh, this is terrifying, then some stupid like PlayStation 2 villain comes stumbling out of the dark, and you're like, oh boy. Someone used a Unity asset pack to build a monster. Good for you.
I mean, that's with the Frankenstein example too. Like, it's also If you just said like he's a monster, he's a very scary monster, it's kind of like, I mean, that's not really compelling. If you say so, is kind of the best reaction you'll get out of people. But just like stitched flesh is like, nobody has stitched flesh. That doesn't sound.
Yes.
That doesn't even sound like. And this is kind of the atmosphere notes of like the words that you pick and how you decide to describe stuff. Like nobody uses the word flesh in a positive ever. Like no one just talks about that normally. People don't even use the
I've got
word
this great
stitched.
skin cream. My flesh feels so soft.
Nobody would ever say that, right? No, that's so
I hate it
weird.
so much.
But like using so as soon as you use that word, people know like a flesh a bad word. I know, and the opposite is true too, right? When you use like softer words or more upbeat words, those things always apply. But like those kind of little things are how you pick up on getting a sense for the creep that's going on. But if you just said like he's a creepy monster, not nearly as impactful as like he is a bundle of stitched flesh and loose sinew. It's like nobody describes anything that way. That's super creepy sounding. All those words are very creepy. They have creepy tones to them. And that's unfortunately kind of a thing where you definitely need to understand English in that sense and kind of know the words. It's sort of intimate knowledge. But saying it out loud can just be enough, because just saying those words out loud, you're kind of like, ugh, that just, your skincare example both made us like, ugh.
Yeah, I hate
That's all
that.
it
That's
takes.
gonna haunt me. And so with that in mind, when we're thinking about atmosphere, I'm going to give you like my major tip for all of this stuff. It's the biggest cheat, and from today's session, over and above clarity, which is just every session, the single biggest gift I can give you is this. Incredibly specific details will do more work for you than a full paragraph of describing every single thing in a room or every single thing on a bundle of stitched flesh and sinew, which admittedly I kind of feel like, having only worked out twice since COVID began, so like I'm just a bundle of sinew now. It's fine. But
They once
specific
connected, now they don't.
yeah, exactly. It's fine. I have a chair and everything's within arm's reach.
Hang on.
Oh, is it sprint o'clock?
There it is. Sprint o'clock. I'll start the sprints.
Sprints begin. Get to writing if you're writing, and otherwise, please enjoy.
But
Continue
yes,
to listen.
specific details.
Specific details. So I've always described this, particularly in playwriting, as like the secret sauce for making a character immediately more interesting. And it's having a wildly specific detail about a character or a location. So we're talking atmosphere right now, so let's talk about that. If I want to, and I'm going to keep speaking in horror terms because horror is particularly good at this, but this applies to everything. You can apply this to certainly romance, anything else. If you think about, particularly in romance, a lot of the time it's either a childhood home or an exotic destination that we've traveled to, that we're leveraging the atmosphere to help us kind of create that exciting sense of like, oh cool, this is a nice place, I'm excited to be here. Before The Bachelor imploded, you can think of this as all the sweeping shots of any time they're going on a destination date. They just go out of their way to show you how romantic this location is. As a writer, that's kind of what you're doing with specific details. So for instance, coming back to horror, if I want to describe a house that's vaguely unsettling, I can say like, oh, well, it's a small house with a door and a pointed roof. Fine, that doesn't really give me much. But if it's a small house with a slanted door that seems to just be off by a couple of degrees, so much so that you wonder whether the door could close at all, I'm immediately like, what the hell is wrong with this house? Like, there's nothing to that. It could literally just be bad craftsmanship. It doesn't really matter. But I know for me, that evokes a much stronger image. And honestly, I run a lot of Dungeons and Dragons because I'm a nerd. But as podcasts, and a huge part of my job as the DM is coming up with those details, because that's what's going to paint the picture faster than anything else. You meet someone walking down the street. They're wearing a long cloak that seems to be dripping. I'm like, okay, that's concerning, as opposed to just like, there's a guy walking down the street. So think about what those specific details are, and think about what the like. Maybe we should actually take a second here to talk about what atmosphere itself is. Atmosphere is just generally the feeling you're trying to evoke for your reader in any given space. So if it is a dark and stormy night, we're trying to evoke a sense of generally speaking, of things being unsettling, things being somewhat mysterious, possibly dangerous. So think about the kind of scene you're trying to create, and also think about, again, what's your intention with this scene. Every scene should have a reason to exist, and not necessarily on your first pass. Pantsers out here, I'm looking at you. But on your edit pass, everything has to have a reason. It should either reveal more about the characters or advance the plot. Otherwise, it probably shouldn't be there. So what's the purpose of the scene? If I'm telling a meet cute, the purpose is I need the characters to meet in a memorable and engaging way that will lead them to seek each other out again. So what's the atmosphere I need for that? There are more meet cutes in coffee shops than I think almost anywhere else in the world, because it's a very easy place for people to collide. But what do I need from that then? Well, if I'm looking for my characters to adorably crash into each other with coffee and be like, oh no, like I got my latte on you and you got your hot chocolate on me, I guess we're star-crossed lovers now. What are the factors I need to create in the atmosphere for that to be a believable scene? Honestly, for that one, it's got to be busy, because if it's not busy, I'm just going to avoid that person. So I know I need to create a sense of busyness. So how do we do that? Easy examples: long lines, noisiness. If the cashier is stressed and anxious, these are all things that tell us, that indicate to us as the reader, that whatever version of coffee shop we've imagined, because we all have one. I'm thinking of the dearly departed Starbucks that just closed down the street from me, where I used to get my fix. We all have that in our head. That's fine. You as the writer are then altering my perception of that space. I'm thinking of my own space. You can't control that, but what you can do is start to paint the picture of what's in there. So if Theo, who's desperately looking to ask out this cute boy he's in love with, is trying to get a coffee, on his way to go ask out cute boy, gets to the cash register, and behind it we see a barista, and they're clearly stressed. They're sweating. Their hair is unkempt, and their apron is soaked in coffee grinds. And they very curtly say, "What do you want?" I have a sudden sense that if I was imagining a nice, sleepy coffee shop with no one in it, I'm wrong. There's a lot going on.
Right.
And just by those little details, those specific details, you're indicating, to Nick's point, giving the reader a chance to go, oh, like it's basically creating like little mysteries for them, if you want to think about it that way.
It really is.
Where it's like, oh, okay, well, why would they be this exhausted? Why is their hair bedraggled? Why are they so out of sorts, and why are they being so mean? Oh, they're super busy. That, combined with all the other just sensory information I've given you about there being a lot of people in there, what have you, is enough for me to go, right, okay, I get it. So just think about those highly specific details. And to our earlier point about not over describing, if you can give me 3, and I'd say 3 is the most you ever really need, 3 highly specific details about a space or a person, that's going to be enough for me to create a pretty clear picture of them. So think about what the most interesting, hooking, engaging details you could tell me about that space you're trying to describe to create that atmosphere are. And that's probably what's going to do it for you. And you don't need much more than that. Because again, we're bringing all the sensory data that our bodies and brains have stored from our entire life to whatever you're creating. We will do so much of the work for you. All you need to do is give us enough guidance to create it. And then we're off to the races. Where you know when to cut is when, and it's hard to do this as yourself, but if you have beta readers or anyone else look at it, as editors, this is often what we do. Once I have that information, I kind of don't want anymore. Then I want to move on. I want to get on with the plot and the story.
That's when you start getting to the like, oh my God, get on with it kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I see this. So there are some exceptions. In a sci-fi or a fantasy world, we often see word counts balloon because you're trying to create and evoke things that don't necessarily exist in our world. If I say it's an airship, it's like, well, those don't exist. So what is that? Mm-hmm. In my head, I just have like 10 Final Fantasy examples. But if you're trying to say it's, a pirate ship with a balloon on top, I need to know that. But I don't need to know, okay, well, and, it's got like this many oars and there's this many cannons and like, ooh, and it's important that the wood is lacquered. Like, I can get all those details later from simple things like he put his hand on the lacquered railing, fine. The captain bragging, we have 58 cannons. I don't need all that in description. But once I have that, I'm like, oh, cool, there's an airship. Tell me more. Like, I want to know what happens on the airship. I don't want to just hear about the airship. Regency falls into this a lot, where, we're going to balls and fancy houses, and particularly in the picking of attire or sizing people up. We want to get just enough to understand, oh, I get it. This person is a higher class, lower class, on hard times, is a rake who is presenting in a way that is unfamiliar and kind of scandalous. Fine, but I don't need every detail. It can be something as simple as, to my surprise, he wasn't wearing a belt. I could see other people's eyes darting to his waist and being as shocked as I was. Cool. We get a sense of that whole guy from that.
He's
like,
a guy.
It's like,
He has no belt.
He has no belt, and he's proud of it. Oh, okay, that's a different thing than blah blah. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. If he looks smug and he has no belt, people are already. I'm already figuring out this type of person that he is, just like that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we're looking for those, just those key details. And again, if you're worried that you have too many, give it to a beta reader, or, and it's hard to do, but read it as objectively as you can with the sole purpose of going, when do I get it? At what point am I like, yeah, all right, I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah.
Like,
and 3 is a good, your rule of 3 is like a pretty good number.
Rule of 3 generally will serve you. It serves in comedy. It serves in description.
Yeah.
Our brains love being able to kind of like, there's a comfort in 3s. It's like this, and it's the Goldilocks thing, right? It's this and this and this. Oh, okay, cool.
We're very wired for pattern recognition, and 2 things is not a pattern, but 3 is. And unfortunately, we're a little too well wired for pattern recognition, so we're just like, if it's got 3, that's a pattern. I don't need any more than 3. I don't need any more data. We did it. And it really does drag you down. I think the example you used, though, of like 3 is really good up front because you're just trying to form that like outline. I get it enough. And then add in those other details just like over time when someone mentions they put their hand on a lacquered whatever. Like people will pick up those pieces, but broadly speaking, if I just need to know like it's a ship in the air and it mostly looks like this, I can work from that. Over time, my vision of it will like refine into more specifically what you wanted, but it's good enough for me to understand what's happening in the scene.
Well, I know for me, and this is kind of transitioning into talking about character. Character operates roughly the same way, and the interesting piece about holding details back is there's a real seductive quality to just dumping all the details up front, so we know exactly who we're dealing with. But again, what do I actually need to know? I remember when I was reading Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park, being a huge fan of the film. By the time I read the book, I was just imagining world's most perfect man, Sam Neill. Whose Instagram is just so wholesome. If you just want to see a man like hanging out with sheep and being delightful. Oh, hello, we've got some cat action. Ripley's still passed out back there, but you know. But I was imagining Sam Neill the whole time whenever Crichton was talking about Dr. Grant, and then it was like 2/3 of the way through the book, he was like, he scratched his beard. I was like, whoa, and it really threw me for a loop because in my head this was not a bearded man, and it actually really took me aback, but it was also one of my first times, I think, actively realizing, oh, okay, I've built a very strong image in my head. The writer has formed a strong image in their head. Honestly, I think I'm just going to stick with mine, but cool. Also, that detail is so insignificant that it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect anything.
Yeah.
He doesn't get his power.
If you missed it, whatever.
His beard doesn't get caught in a fence, allowing raptors to get him. Like, he just is a dude with a beard. Who cares? So, in that case, yes, it was Crichton layering a detail in later on for an image he had in his head, but it kind of didn't matter. And ultimately, I'm glad he didn't dump it up front because I didn't need to know that about Dr. Grant to understand who Dr. Grant is. Just saying, yeah, he's a guy who's out in the field, he's on his knees in some dirt, dusting. I'm like, okay, so he must be wearing like hardy outdoor clothing, doesn't care about his appearance because he's covered in dust all the time. Fine. And that's really all I need to know. So again, just thinking about those highly specific details that will give us enough to build our own character and give us enough to guide whatever we've imagined towards what you're thinking of. Yeah. Again, it's always going to be a conversation between you and the reader. And what's weird with writing, as opposed to say theater or anything else, is once you've written it and put it out into the world, your part's done, aside from engaging with your fans and talking about this sort of stuff with them if you choose to do so, which on Wattpad we would recommend you do. But it's a conversation they're going to have with your work. The conversation you're having is what you've put on the page. What they take from the page is up to them and how they want to conceive of it and everything else. So you don't want to drown them in details. You want to just give them enough guidance to get there, but you also don't want to just throw vague terms at them that don't guide them anywhere, because then you're just hoping that they will imagine exactly what you did, and odds are you're not going to get there. I noticed in the comments, Ren, you pointed something out that I definitely want to touch on. Five senses is great. One of the best compliments I've gotten from my players from Dungeons and Dragons is I evoke smell a lot, which is something a lot of people don't because it's not in film, and it's an easy one to forget about.
It's not in
But
anything. It's not in
yeah,
film or photo or books.
yeah,
Or, like,
exactly.
you can't smell it.
So evoking it, I know has particularly for horror scenarios or anything else can really. I found hooks people in a really interesting way. So, for instance, I was doing a Lovecraft Call of Cthulhu game, and it started to rain, and the rain smelled like sulfur, and they're like, "Oh, something's wrong." And I watched all of them immediately because you say the word sulfur, and everyone I think if like you know what that smells like, right? And everyone's just like, "Oh." But it gave them a much more visceral reaction than if I just say it starts to out of nowhere it starts to rain. That could mean anything. It starts to rain and it smells bad. Is immediately it makes my brain go like, wait, why? And to our point earlier about hooks, that's kind of what we're talking about. It's those little things that make you go, because those are ultimately the things that will make us say, okay, well, what happens next? Tell me more.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately, I mean, it always boils down to Scheherazade and the 1001 Nights, right? The whole job is just
Tell
like,
me again.
I need to know more. Tell me more. It's like, okay, well, if you're sure, I don't have to tell you more. The reader should be like, please just give me more.
And you alluded to that when you described it as kind of like all these descriptions as someone unwraps them are like a miniature mystery. And kind of an important note for everyone in terms of like when you're worried about, and hooray for Amoya, I'm glad we were helpful there.
Hey, that's amazing. Oh, I love hearing that. That's great.
It's been kind of interesting seeing like the complete lack of comments because everyone commented before. They were like, this is really motivating. And then it just stopped in the chatter. So I'm going to assume when the sprint ends, people will come back. But I think what's important for those who are worried about like, will people figure out my special twist or the mysteries I do have is like every time you give them those descriptions to engage with, and those little mini mysteries is less time for them to be thinking about the larger mysteries. And so they'll get really, really sucked into that. For me, I think the final note on atmosphere before we switch over to character on my side is with atmosphere, you can do so much within the same space and it really, really sets the tone, which is if we use the coffee shop, if you're pitching this as like, it's a romantic, lighthearted situation, even if it's a really busy coffee shop, you want to portray that. The words and descriptions you use. So if you focus in on like how you, hear the sweet jingle every time the door opens as someone comes in, and you're nestled into the corner, finding your own little coziness while you watch everything around, or you smell the sweet scents of cinnamon and the sun is bright outside. Like that's a really upbeat feeling that you're putting into this. You're showing people like, hey, welcome to my romance story. You know it's a romance story because I said as such in the description, title, and all that. But like I'm really telling you, they're in a coffee shop and it's a romance. And if you're in that same coffee shop and you're instead describing like each tick of the clock on the wall as like a heartbeat, and that you just smell the that like burnt coffee notes that have gone too far, that'll portray something different. Like people are like, ugh, I don't like this coffee shop. It's kind of off and weird. Exactly the same, like it's just a busy coffee shop. And you choosing to use those particular words or the things that you hone in on as your 3 facts and how you portray them to people are really what's going to set that kind of like tone and feeling, again, to the words that we used, all of that stuff. And if we bring it all the way to Frankenstein, the important thing that you were kind of saying with fantasy stuff and explaining it, like no one before Frankenstein was written, nobody knew what a Frankenstein was. Nobody will ever know what a Frankenstein is really. But like when she wrote that, nobody knew what a Frankenstein was. She could not just refer to it. Like now you can refer to a zombie really quickly because everybody knows. I know what a zombie is. I gotcha. But at that time, like no one knew what it was. And yet it worked. Everyone gets it and everyone has a vision for what it is because she described it in such a way that like you can put it together from what she mentioned, and she gave you enough to be like, I get it. But you don't have to rely on like I have to describe a thing exactly as it is. It's just a note. So I'm seeing stuff that Avery's posting here. So it's really difficult. I know this happens to both of us where we're like in the thought and then someone posts the thing. Right, and correct as people are pointing out, the sprint did end. So congrats to the sprint ending.
969 words. That's amazing, Amanda. Good work.
Man, that's like half a chapter right there for a lot of the average chapters.
I'm so glad that we tricked you into writing.
Woohoo! It was a success.
Oh no! Also, like, always happy for people to just be too engaged to not want to comment. That's also totally fine.
I guess that's okay.
We also
sure.
Just never want you to feel like, oh, they're talking. I don't want to break their flow. Break our flow. We're gabby.
It's very
too
weak.
Much,
we have a weak flow. Any comment really breaks it. I lose my train.
True.
I'm like, I had it. But yeah, on the over description thing too, like, remember every single thing you put in there is so important. So people are just like, okay, if you keep describing this, it must be really important. All these really matter. And I have officially, by the way, Tom, since I know you can't see it, I have officially.
I can actually. No, I've got it running now.
I'm
watching Us in the Past this whole time. I've adjusted my glasses like several times, like a
what
weirdo.
Like 3 seconds
like
in
they're
the past?
cocked at a weird angle. But
yes, I've changed it to intro of character. So there we go.
Yeah, amazing. And on that note, so just before we shift fully into character, in terms of the over describing, it's also worth noting that once you get going on this idea of like what are the very specific details, it's very easy to fall down the trap of describing everything in those terms. So
everything needs 3 details.
Yeah, as Nick was talking about the coffee shop, I'm like, oh, okay, like what would I add to that? And I'm like, oh, yeah, and you get to the table and like it's sticky and there's a napkin that is stuck to the table that's clearly been there for a day. I'm like, yeah, that's great. It's like, oh, okay, well, like what's wrong with the chair? Because this coffee shop sucks and I want to talk about it. As a reader, I probably actually don't need all of that. So again, Pantsers, my fellow Pantsers, looking at you, feel free to include all of that on your first draft. But on your edit pass, what you're going to be doing is looking as you go through it for like, okay, but what's the best one? If I can only have one of these, what's the one that's going to evoke it? Or if I can have 2, like it's not that you only need to use one, but it's a useful exercise. It's a useful mindset to have, which is like, if I only get one, which one's the absolute strongest one? So I could describe the barista, the smell in the air, the ticking clock, or the table. If I only get one of those, which one do I need to tell the scene I'm trying to, like, to set up the scene the best I can? And as anyone who's ever read film noir will know, or hard-boiled detective stuff will know, yeah, you can use more. You can always use more. But consider your pace. Consider, again, what's the purpose of the scene? Odds are, like, very, very rarely is the purpose of the scene to describe a place. There are exceptions. If it's Dracula, I don't know why I'm using all these gothic horror examples today, but I guess that's just where my head's at. Dracula makes great use of like, I'm going to describe in painstaking detail Dracula's castle because it's so weird. And I need you to know how weird this place is, because it's written in first person as a letter home being like, hi, I'm here at this weird, I'm Keanu Reeves and I'm at this weird place. Gary Oldman's here and his hair is a heart for some reason. So again,
that movie made no mistakes. How dare you?
Hey, I'm not saying mistakes. I'm just saying very big choices. But again, it's just looking through and going, okay, is this the experience I want my reader to be having right now? Is it valuable that they know every detail about this space? Or do they just need some, or do they need one? Do they just need like, oh, the clock is ticking like a beating heart? Cool, that's enough. I got enough. I'm good. Or do they need that and the barista is hairy? That'll give you the whole thing. Do they need that and I'm tapping my foot because I'm nervous? All those sorts of things will help build that out. KDB is saying, think sometimes better to say the sentence as simply as possible. 100%. There are very few examples in the history of time and space where writing more was the answer. It's clarity. Again, clarity. The other thing to remember, and this is a bit of a tangent, but it's one worth going on. It's something I'm going to come back to a lot, is respect your reader's time and attention. The world moves very fast these days, and we have so many entertainments around us. I am surrounded by bookshelves here. I have a stack of video games I should play at some point, but haven't, and buy more, let alone all the movies, TVs, books, plays that are on demand, all this sort of stuff. Exactly. So if I've chosen to dedicate my time to reading your thing, one of your goals as a writer should be to make sure that you're respecting my time and interest. Because if you do that, I'm going to be really excited and stick with you. If I feel like you're wasting my time or not, like, think about any time you've yelled at a book, like, get to the point. Like, I get it. Can you get to the point, please? Rom-coms are a fascinating genre for this because the most successful ones manage to get to the point while also dragging everything out. The least successful ones, you just spend the whole time being like, you're obviously going to fall in love. I don't care. This doesn't have to be a mystery. Like, we know where we're going. Just shut up and get to it. So
That's definitely a
Anyway.
problem of engagement too in those cases. Oh,
Yep.
I gotta start the sprint again.
It's sprint o'clock. All right, one more sprint to finish strong, my friends. So anyway, with that in mind, let's talk about character. So again, you're starting from a blank canvas. Odds are you've got a pretty good idea of your character in your head, and you should. That's great. Or you might just be meeting them or discovering them as you go. That's also fine. But how you choose to introduce them to us is going to generally flavor the way we think about them because they don't exist until you tell us they do. This is again going back to my like never start your book with dialogue piece that Deanna over at Books has drilled pretty hard into my head. If I just throw out a line of dialogue, I have no idea who said it, what they look like, where they are, what's going on. I know that's a tempting trick as a writer to be like, isn't it suspenseful though? And it is suspenseful. Good work. But it's also confusing and vague and not clear. And we want clarity. So how you introduce your characters matters. It will shape how we think about them. It will shape our immediate attachment to them. And it will likely kind of set up how we feel about them for the rest of the journey. So with that in mind, particularly, and we're talking specifically third person for now. We'll talk about first person a little bit before the day is out. But with that in mind, let's talk about specific details again. What do I need to know to evoke this character? And more importantly, as a writer, it likely means that you need to take that character that you've imagined and just boil them down to a basic idea of like, okay, what 3 cool things, particularly if we're just talking visually or even attitudinally, if that's a possible thing to get across, not talking dialogue, just purely we're meeting this character, what's going to evoke them? So we talked earlier about the guy at the ball not wearing a belt and being smug. A classic example of this is the jaunty hat. So in Victorian times, hats were very important, and how people wore hats said a lot about who they were. Top hats were in, and that was kind of the order of the day. Bowler hats were generally seen as lower class, and they meant you had a rebellious streak if you were wearing one to a formal event. So with that in mind, if 3 gentlemen in top hats arrive to a party, and then a guy shows up with a bowler hat at a jaunty angle, we know a lot about that guy if we're Victorians. Right now, we're just kind of like, okay, you're all wearing hats, which to us is super formal, so meh.
Well,
But
plus we
to
already
people
established he has no belt, so he's like super.
Yes, and he has no belt, which I mean, really, that's just bad.
Bowler
bad
hat,
planning.
no belt.
Yeah, he's truly the rebel without a cause. Like, I don't know, I already feel like I'm gonna run into him in a high school and fall in love with him because he's the bad boy I need. Victorian bad boy. You heard it here first. Coming soon. Yeah, so what are those details? What are the things you can tell us that give us an immediate sense of who this person is? Honestly, paranormal is great at this. Werewolf stories kill at this. Vampire stories also very good at this, where they show up and there's just something about them. I mean, this is a hacky example, and I do apologize, but like the Twilight description of Edward Cullen, we're like, oh man, I know who that guy is. You know, it's like tall, unnaturally piercing eyes, pale skin. I'm like, oh man, that dude's a vampire.
I hate that description so much.
No doubt. Yeah, you should, because it's overused. But the point is, I immediately have an idea in my head of who that guy is, and wouldn't you know it, he's exactly who I thought he was going to be.
Yes, it's a very effective description, even if I hate it. And this is a fair note of like cliche as description, which is kind of like, it's fun. You can't. No one can invent something that doesn't already exist. If you look back on like sci-fi throughout the years, it's quite bad at predicting what the future will look like, because it can really only predict it based on what it currently knows. It just doesn't know that we're going to invent this internet thing, and that's going to completely redefine how we connect with each other. Or why you see in the 80s when like Neuromancer and stuff came out, like the internet had just been invented, so everyone was like, probably the future will be all internet all the time, but in very weird ways, where we'll like log into it and
got all my hidden secrets on this cassette tape.
Yeah, very strange,
internet
very strange
tape.
stuff. So in that sense, like, you can't possibly describe anyone in a way where they don't already exist. So like, don't worry about that, and also use that to your strength, right? If you know someone shows up in a jaunty, if someone's walking around a high school in a like leather jacket, even though it's summer, either they're trying really hard to be that kind of stereotype, or they are that stereotype. Those are the only 2 possibilities, really. Like, who else is just randomly wearing that kind of outfit? And it's fine, just lean into it. Or like, if someone is really that this shy, fidgety, nervous guy we've been talking about probably has a handful of looks that you can go with that'll work for you. It's why there's classic pairings of like the tightly wound guy and then the like bubbly free spirit in that sense.
Yeah.
But you have to lean into these cliches and just be like, look, this is how I describe them, because people need, they basically take these as kind of puzzle pieces and then fit them together quickly. Okay, bowler hat, no belt, Victorian. I got it. Okay, so he's like a rebel bad boy. Thank you. And then you move right along. And you shouldn't have to worry as a person of like, how do I describe that he's a rebel, but in a way like no one's ever done before? So I'm not going to describe that he has a bowler hat and a belt. Once you do that, it makes it so convoluted for someone to even figure out what you're trying to describe that they'll give up. They're disinterested. They're like, okay, I guess that makes them, or they don't know what you're trying to describe because they've never seen something like that before. So they're just like, I don't know what this is supposed to, what am I supposed to take from a character who, shifts their eyes left to right constantly. It's like, what? No one does that.
That could mean anything. Yeah.
Like nobody does that in their day to day. That's only a joke as the shifty eye character. But like nobody really naturally ever actually does that. So I'd just be like, who's constantly, do they have an eye problem? Do they have a focus problem? Are they shifty? I don't know. Don't use that kind of stuff in an effort to be like the first person to ever describe them that way or to avoid cliche. You're going to go into that pathway no matter what.
And if you're worried about coming off as cliche, the trick is to find, again, what's hooky about it? What's different about this version of the character? For instance, one of the stories I'm working on at Wattpad right now with a writer, bad boy, skateboard, leather jacket, has pink hair. The pink hair makes me go, oh, because that's just something I've very rarely have ever seen on a bad boy character. And it just immediately, and I remember when this story was kind of first on our radar, everyone who hit it was kind of like, oh, wow, yeah, okay. So we're not saying that, like there are problems with cliche, there are problems with tropes, absolutely. And just using those never really works. But to Nick's point, we're immediately, like we all think in tropes. We all think in pop culture memes. We're going to start plugging those in. If you want to think of it as an easy example, it's a little bit like you've dumped a big bucket of Lego on the floor. Or rather, you're telling a story, but all I have is Lego. So I'm just going to construct it with whatever Lego I have. And so if my image of bad boy is, this is showing my age and my love of golden age of Hollywood, but like if I'm thinking bad boy and I'm thinking like James Dean, sweatback hair, leather jacket, cigarette dangling out of his mouth.
Oh boy.
That's the first thing I'm going to think when I hear bad boy. And then you basically start modulating that for me. So again, that's where the specific details come in, because that's what I've got in my head when you say bad boy. That's just immediately who I'm thinking of. And that is, I guarantee you, not who you want me to be thinking of. So let's start looking at details. Like, okay, so, he's got pink hair. He's wearing heart-shaped glasses and he's got a biker jacket. I'm like, oh, wow. That's not what I was imagining, but it's
weird
close
kind
enough.
of bad boy. Yeah.
Basically, you've given me enough trope and cliche, and I like this. Cliches are like salt, use in moderation. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's enough to get me to where you need me to get to, but you've also given me a reason to care. And that ultimately is the thing I want to hit. This is yet another one of my, like, I'll be talking about this a lot, but like the why should I give a damn question is a big one. And it's kind of your job as a writer to constantly be giving your readers a reason to care. And that is, Alessandra in Studios calls this the edge on an idea. We call it the hook a lot, but it's like, what's that unique thing that makes me kind of stop and go, oh, that is interesting. Tell me more. Mm-hmm. For instance, with Theo, our love-struck nervous guy, if he's wearing a leather jacket, has a stud through his lip, under his lip, and a face tattoo, and he's nervous and shuffling his feet. I'm like, what is going on with this guy? I love it because he is, I understand the tropes of like the nervous, I don't want to ask this person, I'm kind of shy, but I've rarely seen that done where it's like someone who is, in like a serious punk phase. That's super fun. And also, like, we know that all this happens in the world. Like, we know they're all, like, no matter
everybody's nervous,
like what you dress, like everyone's got all of these quirks. It's just in pop culture we very rarely see it. So again, it's just finding like what is the edge. So ultimately, again, with all of this, when you're introducing your character, what do I need to understand who you're trying to describe to me, and what can you give me about them that makes me go because that ultimately is what's going to make me stay.
The fun part about that example too in particular is that no matter which way you introduce it, both will be valid. If you first describe them as punky, and then reveal that they're nervous, you're like, what makes a punk this type of nervous? That's interesting. And then the opposite, if you try to describe them as very nervous and thinking about this love they're about to confess to, and then describe them as punky, you're like, wow, okay, that's not who I thought. Both of them are really fun. Yeah, I've heard a similar thing with to what Ren's talking about. Of it was on someone critiquing cliche, because they were like, cliche is all the ingredients that make up like a dish. So like no one critiques a dish of like chicken and broccoli by being like, it's too chickeny. Like that's not a. They're just like you can't critique that it has the ingredient in it. It just has the ingredient. So that's kind of a way to think about it. The trick that I personally use in my stories for character, that's very much along your note here, is I like to introduce a lot of my early characters as effectively caricatures or very two-dimensional really quickly off the bat, so that I can establish like, okay, you know who this is by tropes, you know what type of character there are really quickly. I put them into one of the archetypes. I'm totally fine with that. And then I just add like one extra bit of depth so that they're not exclusively just like the bad boy with a heart of gold. That's just like they all are. That's still pretty two-dimensional. I'm just like, they're that, but they like, I describe them as a punk. They totally are. They're 100% a punk, but they kind of keep giving a look at like this artwork of a flower and really being like, really love that artwork. Just something that makes you be like, okay, I get who they are really quickly. I'm into your story. I got it. Because I'm just trying to establish off the bat, like, who are we working with? As you keep saying, right, these readers are working with nothing. They don't know what they're coming into. So I'm really quickly just trying to be like, here they are. In the loosest sense, like the fastest way to describe someone to someone. It's kind of how you introduce someone to a friend. Oh, when you meet them, they're like pretty high energy, kind of really off the walls, and they're like, got it. They're hyper. Even though I'm sure they're about more than just that. But you just want to get out them. This is really what they're about. But they're into some other stuff too. And then throughout the rest of the story, I spend that time being like, let me show you the depths of this character. But I don't want to open up with like, they're a deep mystery of blah, blah, blah. Let me tell you all their interests. And I just want to really quickly be like, they're hyper, they're high energy, but they're really trying to get into meditation, something like that.
Yeah.
And throw that throughout the story.
And on that note, I know a lot of people do dream casts at the top of their stories. Generally speaking, we'd like to discourage that because it's and we can talk more about this in a different episode. But
it takes away the imagination.
More importantly, it's a hurdle a reader has to get over to get to your story.
Right,
literally, you're
reason.
like, it's like every recipe you can find on the internet right now, where it's like,
oh
cool, I really want to make this lasagna, and it's like, when I was 12, my father built a lawnmower, and I'm like, I don't care, just let me make my lasagna.
They just blog about the recipe forever. I'm just like exactly. scrolling.
Wild. Anyway, but part of the reason people do that, I think, is because you have in your head, generally speaking, a Hollywood actor or TV actor that you think could play the part, and you're trying to evoke that person for your readers. One thing I always do in our Dungeons and Dragons podcast, because they are a purely audio medium, is if I need to shortcut people to a character, I'll often be like, okay, it's a Terry Crews type guy. So, he's tall, he's super muscly, big grin. And people are like, oh, cool. Yeah, I get it. I know Terry Crews. Oh, I know exactly what this guy looks like. And I'm like, yeah, and he's got blades for hands and wings. You're like, okay, it's Terry Crews with blades for hands and wings. I'm there.
Substitute some stuff.
I'm not saying you should put actors in your story like that, but it's a useful way if you want to try and help yourself figure out what about a character you're actually trying to describe by going like, okay, well, if I had to cast this in Hollywood, who would it be? And I'm like, okay, it's Meryl Streep. I'm like, okay, but what about Meryl Streep is it that would make me think Meryl Streep should play this person? And those are the qualities that ultimately you kind of want to nail. I'm like, because in my head it's always just Devil Wears Prada. So like, she's got this curious energy. Yes, yeah, Meryl Prime. This sense of like authority and power, and just a casual coolness of unattainably awesome, like, oh god, I just want to be her, but I'm also terrified of her. Cool, those are the elements I want to tell about my character. It's actually not related to Meryl Streep at all, much as I love her. Here's an Oscar, I guess. It's just me trying to figure out what are those qualities I'm trying to describe. So feel free to do that. Make your little dream cast, but then interrogate it yourself. Don't post it, just think about it. Why am I thinking of this actor? What are the qualities that this actor brings? Oh, okay, these are things that must be true about that character, ergo I should drop in I mean, again, Devil Wears Prada, the entire opening is sold on everyone screaming and running for their desks the minute it's announced that she's coming. We actually
Right.
don't need any,
Right.
like, they do all the work for her. And we'll talk about that, not next week, maybe next week, because there's a
Future
concept
week.
called Praise and Speech of the Monster that is all about this, that is the absolute best. But that's a story for another night. Hook! So
Right as the
thank you for
sprint
joining
ended
us.
too. Well done.
That is the end of the sprint. That is the end of StorySights for this week. Thank you all so much for your kind comments today about how much you were enjoying this. I'm so glad to hear that it's useful, and literally nothing makes us happier on this than hearing that we've helped you get over a problem or get re-inspired or have given you a new way to think about your stuff. That's the whole reason we're here, and that makes me so happy.
Hey, 1547 words. Well done.
Oh, damn. All right. Well, congrats, Amanda. That is all kinds of awesome. Well done. And particularly on a day where you weren't feeling like writing or motivated to writing, like punching out anything when you're coming in from that mindset is wild. Punching out a whole new chapter is like next level. So congratulations. Yep. Yeah, you should feel great about that. And for the rest of you, once again, I know I say this every week. We've been doing this, 3 weeks? So it's not like this is like a huge habit, but you should all also just take a second to acknowledge the time you put in today. Even though you weren't writing, this is writing. This is part of the craft of writing. The time you spent listening to us, thinking about how it relates to your own stuff, tuning us out because you had a cool idea about your own work, that's all part of the process. So congrats to you, all of you, for making the time in your day to think about writing. It is so hard to do that, and you did it today. So thank you very much for doing so, and thank you for choosing to take that time with us. And for engaging and bringing your own experiences and everything else. So I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. We'll be back next Thursday, not Friday. So stay tuned for announcements on that. And we have an exit cat. And, just try not to think about stitched flesh and a ball of sinew for the rest of the night. I know I will try.
No, I'm going to be thinking about rubbing screen cream on flesh for the rest of the week. That's just... Thanks a lot. That's going to stick with me forever. So.
That's what we're here for. Horrifying images.
What a way to ending. But yes.
All right. And I will leave you
everybody.
on Dog in the Sun.
Dog in the sun?
Oh, wow. She is so light you can't see her, but she's over there.
Invisible dog.
Invisible dog. I'll leave you on an invisible dog.
Bye, everybody.
Should use better descriptors.